So I had the idea back when we first started talking about what the new workshop was going to look like to use plywood panels to cover the ceiling. This shop is eventually going to be filled with tools and building materials, so I want the actual bones of the interior to stay really clean and modern to help alleviate some of the visual chaos that is sort of unavoidable in a workshop. So I like the idea of keeping the walls smooth and white, but using wood overhead. Also, if I'm being totally honest, Aaron and I are doing most of this work ourselves, and I really did not want to have to deal with drywall mudding this Vulcan ceiling. Sheets of plywood butting up against each other means no mudding or sanding overhead, except for the closet, but that's a small enough space. Now, while the install is easier and saves many steps when compared to drywalling, a plywood ceiling is more expensive. Drywall sheets are cheap, plywood is not. When we get to the end of this video, I'll break down our costs so you can decide if it was worth it.
A few weeks ago, we had the ceiling in the new workshop spray foamed, making it airtight and insulated. Once the foam had cured, we were ready to start adding some plywood. We decided to go with half-inch pre-finished birch plywood panels. Now this is definitely not the cheapest option, but the color and grain are exactly what we were aiming for aesthetically, and the ultra-smooth glossy surface really elevates the overall look. To get the sheets all the way up to the top of the ceiling, we employed the help of our handy-dandy drywall lift. We bought this lift years ago when we first started remodeling our house and had planned on selling it to free up space, but I'm glad we at least held onto it for now. It made easy work of raising these panels in place. To cut the plywood to size, I used my track saw. Luckily, because the plywood sheets are only a half an inch thick, they weren't noticeably heavier than drywall sheets, so they weren't too difficult to handle. Installing the panels to the ceiling follows mostly the same rules as hanging drywall. You want to make sure each panel ends on half of the roof rafter or ceiling joist, so the following panel can attach to the other half of that rafter. To secure the plywood to the roof rafters, we use these trim head screws. The slim profile and small screw head makes for a nice, neat look without creating large holes that might need to be filled or covered later. We spaced our screws about 12 inches apart along each rafter and used our laser level to make sure we were safely screwing into the rafters and maintaining a straight line. We used a hole saw to cut holes for our overhead lighting electrical boxes, and our oscillating tool to cut out a rectangular opening that will house outlets to power our overhead air scrubbers. Dealing with obstacles like this requires careful measuring, so take your time. Mistakes in drywall can always be mudded over with joint compound, but with plywood there's nothing to cover up mistakes later. Plus, the sheets are expensive, so mistakes are costly. Aaron made sure to run the electrical wires with enough slack to give us some wiggle room, and we installed old work boxes so that we wouldn't necessarily need to nail the placement exactly right, since the electrical box itself will get installed after the plywood is up. Once we got the hang of it, the install went pretty quickly and without any major bumps. The one tip I would leave you with is to make sure to keep an eye on the color variations of your panels. We didn't pay close enough attention when we bought the sheets or when we went to install them. But this is wood, so the color from one panel to the next is going to vary. Ultimately, we ended up with a pretty uniform look, except for one panel which leans a little red compared to the ones around it and sticks out like a sore thumb. But I've been trying to learn to appreciate life's imperfections lately, so this spot can serve as a nice reminder to embrace the imperfect whenever I look up at it. Once our drywall was complete, the overall effect is honestly better than I could have hoped for. There's definitely things we would have done differently and drawbacks to a ceiling like this, but I am glad we went for it. It's not a look that would really work in every space, but for a garage workshop, we think it's pretty cool. So what did it all cost? The materials were pretty minimal, just plywood panels and screws. Each panel was about $66, and we bought 10 4 feet by 8 feet sheets, so that's around $665 in plywood. And we bought 2 boxes of screws for a total of $20 in fasteners. That brings us to a total of about $685. Compared to the overall cost of rebuilding this entire workshop, that's not much, but nearly $700 for a ceiling is very, very expensive, especially when you consider one sheet of half-inch drywall is only like $15. Of course, there is also a sort of intangible cost of our time. Going for this type of ceiling versus drywall hanging, mudding, and sanding definitely saved us a ton of time and frustration. Plus, we think it adds a unique and interesting look to the space, but let us know what you think.